if John Lennon was alive today, he'd be Kanye West.
Hello and welcome back to another Mind Matters. I'm Elon Martin, and with me in the studio today are Harrison Keeley and Adam Daniels. And recently, being Beatles fans, we watched a documentary called Get Back, which was 60 hours of live footage of the Beatles recording their music and preparing for a live concert.
I should just butt in and say the documentary itself isn't 60 hours, but it utilizes footage from 60 hours worth.
Yes, the documentary was whittled down to 8 hours, and it was edited and cleaned up and put together in such a way as to make that 60 hours very enjoyable and giving great insight into the creative process of what is arguably one of the most prolific and innovative and influential rock bands in history. Anyone who's familiar with the Beatles knows at least a dozen songs that they probably like. In any case, while watching this documentary, we were privy to a lot of insights and dimensions of personality in the Beatles, and especially John Lennon. And without giving too much away, there were a lot of dynamics.
We can spoil it.
You want to spoil it?
That's old news.
Well, the bit that I was going to focus on is new news. In the sense that there was a private conversation that was taped between Paul McCartney and John Lennon during a very crucial time in their recording of these sessions. And what had happened was George Harrison had effectively left the band, and there were personality differences, creative differences, and it fell upon John and Paul, who were the creators of the band and the senior-most members and the creative force, largely, behind the Beatles, to hash things out. And so what Peter Jackson included in this documentary was this very intimate, honest, vulnerable, almost painful conversation between these two giants, where they talk about egos, they talk about fear, they talk about how George Harrison had been sidelined effectively, and Paul and John actually did quite a bit of reflection in this short conversation on their own behavior and trying to take responsibility for George's reaction and desire to leave the band. And this discussion was a reminder, I think, to us about John Lennon's, not only his talent, but his who he was as a person. Because I don't know about you guys, but I've seen a number of interviews with him where he can be very, very harsh, whipsaw sharp in reacting to people. He had a sharp tongue, but this was a dimension to the man that was deeply caring, willing to fess up to his own shortcomings and his own weaknesses. And it reflected a level of being, if you want to say that was impressive to me, and I think to us. It was a surprise that showed a lot of insight into who he was as an individual, and speaks a lot to what he was trying to accomplish in later years post-Beatles, and we'll get to that. So, needless to say, or maybe it warrants saying, this conversation between Lennon and McCartney, the honesty that they had with one another, and the new place that they had come to in being honest, was carried forward in a second conversation and discussion that the group had together with George, where they're trying to get him back into the band, and it worked. It was probably, we're not privy to what was discussed with George, but we imagine that the work that these guys had done on themselves and with each other was what induced George to come back, and the whole rest of the documentary demonstrates just what made this band so amazing, and how much they loved each other, and how much creativity they were able to generate once they were able to get past this kind of this emotional hurdle. So there is that, and what this kind of rediscovering of John had caused in us, or in me, was a revisiting of his political activity and all the famous quotes that have been attributed to him that showed incredible levels of insight into the state of politics in the West, and in particular in the U.S., where he was trying to gain citizenship, and where, because he was such a powerful, deeply thoughtful voice for ending war. War is over if you want it. He basically made enemies of the FBI, of the CIA, and of Richard Nixon in particular in 1972, where there were these declassified memos that basically called for planting drugs on Mr. Lennon, and trying to get him arrested and ultimately deported from the U.S., where he would be, less likely a troublemaker. And so there is that about him. He had some wonderful quotes that I'd just like to read a few of. He said, "You got to remember, establishment, it's just a name for evil. The monster doesn't care whether it kills all the students or whether there's a revolution. It's not thinking logically. It's out of control." And there's another couple of ones here. He says, this is probably one of his most famous. "I think all our society is run by insane people for insane objectives. I think we're being run by maniacs for maniacal means. If anybody can put on paper what our government and the American government and the Russian, Chinese, what they are trying to do and what they think they're doing, I'd be very pleased to know what they think they're doing. I think they're all insane, but I'm liable to be put away as insane for expressing that. That's what's insane about it." And one more. This was when John Lennon was beginning a kind of anti-war movement, and he had just come off of a concert where he gave a protest song about a poet who was imprisoned, a left-leaning poet, a very progressive poet by the name of John Sinclair, who was put in prison basically in the early 70s for 10 years for being in possession of 2 marijuana cigarettes. So John Lennon goes out, he sings this song, and then within 2 days, the Supreme Court of Michigan basically releases John Sinclair. So this was a demonstration to the U.S. intelligence apparatus, political infrastructure, of John Lennon's power, of his ability to influence, of his rationality. There are some people in the government who had called Lennon a radical leftist. And as we'll see with a few more quotes, he wasn't a radical leftist. He was a rational leftist. So there's one quote. This is from an article written just a couple of years ago by, let's see what his name is. I'll get the name in just a moment. But it says left-wing activists who were on government watch lists and who shared an interest in bringing down the Nixon administration had been congregating at Lennon's New York apartment. But when they revealed that they were planning to cause a riot, Lennon balked. As he recounted in a 1980 interview, quote, "We said, we ain't buying this. We're not going to draw children into a situation to create violence so you can overthrow what and replace it with what? It was all based on this illusion that you can create violence and overthrow what is and get communism or get some right-wing lunatic or left-wing lunatic. They're all lunatics." So he was falling or put himself outside of this this left-wing versus right-wing paradigm. And this is evident with songs like Revolution, where, he talks about or sings about, if you're going to go along with Chairman Mao, you're not going to make it with anybody anyhow. So he was against this kind of radical left, reactionary, crazy-making, violent behavior. He was all about ideas and bringing those ideas through his music, through his art, to a very large number of people. He already had an incredible built-in audience, people who were paying attention to his music and to his words. So he was a force to be reckoned with. And unfortunately, in December of 1980, his life was cut tragically short. He was assassinated by Mark David Chapman, just outside of John Lennon's Dakota residence in New York City. And Chapman is an interesting figure. He had actually 2 months earlier gone to New York City from, I think it was Hawaii, where he lived with his wife, and made his first foray, his first attempt at killing Lennon, but decided that he didn't want to do it. Came back to Hawaii, fessed up to his wife, and then a few months later came back to New York and actually went through with the act. Only earlier in the day that Chapman had killed Lennon with 4 gunshots to Lennon's back. He had met Lennon in Central Park, or in the vicinity of the Dakota building, and asked Lennon to write his autograph, to autograph some albums. And in interviews, Chapman says that Lennon was actually extremely gracious and kind to him, and even asked Chapman if there was anything else he could do for him. All the while, he had someplace to go and was ready to leave with Yoko to a recording or some other appointment. So, such a senseless murder, but certainly not senseless to individuals who may or may not have induced Chapman to kill Lennon. And there are some reasons to suggest that Chapman was a kind of brainwashed subject, a la, Sirhan or any of these other quote unquote low nut individuals. The policemen who took him in, 2 of them had separately made statements to say that Chapman looked like he was programmed. was behaving and sounding like he was programmed. And they knew how crazy that sounded, and yet they said it to the press. And there have been books written on the subject. So I think we can assign a fair probability to the idea that Lennon was, after a bout with heroin addiction and coming back into his own and about to release his Double Fantasy album, really continuing to be a political force to be reckoned with. And we can talk about, some of the dimensions to his personality that haven't been mentioned, that made him such an incredible person, and such an effective voice for anti-war movements and free speech. Because just as a reminder, I mean, there's a lot of information to suggest that Martin Luther King's venturing into the anti-war movement after the civil rights movement was ultimately what triggered the response from the U.S. government and military agencies to have him assassinated. So anything that was too powerfully anti-war and too effective, and couldn't easily be pigeonholed as a radical left or crazy force that can easily be subverted and imprisoned, was a real threat to the interests of the U.S. and the West in maintaining the war industry and subjecting countries around the world to its political whims. So,
well, that was so like you were talking about, it's his anti-war stance that, at least from my very limited knowledge of John Lennon, because I was never a huge Beatles fan growing up. My dad was, but and some of their songs, I really enjoyed, but it wasn't my particularly favorite genre. So I never really looked much into, who they were and what they did in terms of people, not just like Beatles, the band, but people. So from my limited perspective, it does seem like the anti-war stance of John Lennon is the thing that was most scary from the point of view of the establishment. Mm-hmm. It's like we said on our show last week with Richard Spence, war is a very, very profitable, if not the most profitable industry. So anything that seeks to shut that down is very, very dangerous. There was somebody that I knew who was talking about working in a casino industry. And they were like, if you want to know the best piece of advice I could give you, don't mess with the man's money. That will get you screwed. And I mean, granted, he was talking specifically about, the casino industry and not trying to screw over a casino, because that's a bad idea, because, they've got the money to take you to court and all that fun stuff. But it's applicable here too, where all of these different political figures, how many people within the current U.S. government have, millions of dollars of stocks and stock options or whatever for Raytheon, mm-hmm. or some other, Lockheed Martin. Not a small number. So anything that would cut into those, the profit margins of those companies, well, then you're talking about butting heads with the heads of state, which is, how you end up dead. But it was interesting to me how because you have to look at everything into its context. And so one of the things about the 60s and the 70s was, at least from, previous shows that we've done, there was the infestation of academia with postmodernism, postmodern thought, and also like Frankfurt School style communist infused postmodernism. Mm-hmm. And it was an attempt to subvert academia for communist ends from that perspective. And so that's kind of part of the context of where Lennon was kind of battling it out and looking for answers and thinking things through. And like you said, they couldn't pigeonhole him in like a radical communist hole, which would have been perfectly fine for them. It would have been better for them had he done so, because then they would have something more tangible with which to smear him. Mm-hmm. But because he wasn't a violent radical, that made things very tricky for them. And so the fact that he was anti-war and he was peaceful about it and realized, and this is one of the things about him that I kind of want to look more into, is just the things that he said is in a sense postmodern. He's rejecting meta-narratives, both from the conservative standpoint and from the left standpoint. Communism is a meta-narrative, and he rejected that, openly rejected that. Mm-hmm. So in that sense, he's postmodern, but not in the sense of having been duped into becoming the thing that he was trying to rail against. Like he very much was his own person with his own mind.
Right.
I think that's the most important thing, is that, he was an artist, like first and foremost, and like literally like poet, artist, musician. And in that sense, he was a true postmodernist, in that like some of the Beatles' work in the mid to late 60s was extremely postmodern. They did, and that's where postmodernism first got put into practice. It was in art. So you had, whole art movements that were postmodern in the sense of like Cubism and abstract expressionism and things like that. And so John, and of course also through his relationship with Yoko, who is also a postmodern artist, that just like, he was a postmodernist in the sense of, he was kind of like an intuitive and, like I'd say, like an unschooled postmodernist, which a lot of artists are. It's not like the most postmodern artists probably haven't read any books by any actual postmodern philosopher. It's just they get it intuitively because that's what they're like. And that's the feature that I think is most prominent in John Lennon, in all these features of his personality. It's his creativity. The interesting thing is how all those things tied together. The facts of his personality, just who he was, with the contingencies of the life that he led. So if you look at the Beatles, one of the interesting things about the documentary is, well, first of all, there is a tiny short mini documentary at the very beginning that goes over their history, kind of just leading up to these recording sessions, which were in January 1969. They'd been, they hadn't toured in like 2 or 3 years. No public appearances really, and I don't know if this is an accurate summary, but based on that little documentary, it was probably after the Beatles went on tour. I think it was in '66 in the U.S., and John Lennon made that infamous statement about him or them being like bigger than Jesus, and that caused a whole bunch of controversy. And then very soon after that, they quit touring. They had to in a precursor to modern cancel culture, they had to make public apologies and say, "Oh, I didn't really mean it like that. I'm sorry. I'm sorry I offended people by comparing myself with Jesus," or something like that. And he kind of said, "Well, it was taken out of context, and that's not really what I meant." Kind of had to backpedal a little bit on that. So anyways, that's the context of this documentary. And like Ilan said at the beginning, the Beatles were extremely prolific. Like Lennon and McCartney were one of the kind of songwriting duos of humanity. And they were at times releasing like 3 albums a year. So in the studio constantly and writing songs. And so they haven't been in the public eye for 2 or 3 years. And so they start 1969 with this plan to do a TV special, record an album, and do a TV special album and do a concert. So their first concert in years. And they've only got like 3 weeks to do it. I think originally it might have only been like 2.5 weeks or something, because Ringo had to star in a film. He was starting shooting at the end of January, so they had to put together like an album's worth or a concert's worth of new songs in order to perform. And they get into this big studio where they're going to film Ringo's movie, and right away in those first days, they get there and the sound isn't very good. They don't like it. You can tell none of them really want to be there. They're not smiling. They're not having fun. Like my impression after watching the first half or the first part of 3, which ends with George quitting the band and walking out, is like they were just kind of like dicking around. They were like they'd bring in a few new songs, but they weren't really working very hard. They weren't really communicating with each other. It was just like, oh wow, that was an unproductive 8 days out of the 2.5 weeks they have to put together 14 songs. But one of the things that happens is like in those like, I don't know if it was day 6 or 7, they're trying to figure out, like, they don't have anything planned. They don't know where they're going to do the concert. They're not sure how they're going to do it. One of their producers is like pushing for them to film it in Libya at the old Roman Colosseum there or amphitheater. And, but they don't know what they're going to do. This film crew's filming this documentary. They don't really know how it's going to turn out. And, one of the captions that Peter Jackson puts on is that, this one morning, Paul McCartney was kind of feeling the pressure and, kind of worried about what the fate of the project and what they're actually going to do. And he's just sitting there like noodling on his guitar, and you see him actually write Get Back. And you can tell that he's coming up with it for the first time. Well, maybe he had like a little bit of an idea for a chord progression, but he starts playing something, you sound, oh, that sounds kind of familiar. And then as it goes on, it just kind of takes shape. And then he's got the kernel of the song right there. And then that was musically, that was one of the most interesting things for me to watch was the development of that song. I think that's why Peter Jackson called it Get Back. Well, one of the reasons, of course, because it's apropos in many ways. But then after that, they decide to move into Apple Studios, their production company, and an actual recording studio to record some stuff. And a couple things happen. Well, first, it sounds better in there. They feel comfortable in there. It's not this big cavernous space. So it's a more conducive environment, both sonically and just spatially. And then an old friend of theirs, Billy, what's his name?
Preston.
Billy Preston, the keyboard player for, who did he play with? Was it
Little Richard? No.
Little Richard?
Well, he played with a lot of different artists, but he was featured as his own.
No, but who was? Remember they mentioned he was the main keyboardist for
somebody in Hamburg.
Yeah, it might have been. That was where they Little met, Richard.
Anyway.
But anyway, so he was friends with the band, and he shows up, and they'd just been talking about like needing a keyboard player, and no, it wasn't Little Richard. Can't remember. But so he just sits down with them and starts playing, and they're like, "Oh, hey, this is great." And they eventually ask him to. Well, he's there for the rest of the recording for the next week or 2 weeks, and from that first day of him playing there, like he's a fan of the band. He would come to watch them and request songs, and they got along, and so he's just jazzed to be there. Like he's happy, like he's smiling, he's having the time of his life being able to play with the Beatles, right? And so I think it was that kind of combination of a bunch of things. It was the introduction of Billy. It was getting George back in the band. They'd kind of established a kind of plan for how to proceed interpersonally and musically, and the new space that you could see the change in all of them, how it kind of loosened things up and let them enjoy themselves. And from then on, the kind of the creative juices start flowing, and you can see how they gel and things come together. Now, so that was the main. So that was refers back to that main point about John Lennon, was the creativity, because primarily the impression you get from watching this is that, first of all, it's fun. It's fun seeing all their personalities, because they're so different, but they're similar in certain ways. Like, they're really goofy. Like, they're just goofing around all the time, in a really endearing way for the most part. Like, and that's an aspect of the creativity too. So they're supposed to be recording this album, right, and coming up with new songs, and they go through and play, like, and at the credits at the end of at the end of each episode, it goes through all the songs that they've played, and it's like probably like 100 songs, but old songs of theirs, classics, traditional songs. They're just jamming for the most part and just having fun, which gives the impression, that kind of gives the impression that, why aren't you guys actually working? But that was kind of necessary for this creative process. And you can see this in John at several points. Like, at one point, it's either George or Paul were trying to come up with some lyrics and didn't know what to say. And then John says something like, "Oh, you just say the first thing." I sound Scottish. Say the first thing that comes into your head. You just
say what comes in your head.
Yeah, just say what comes in your head, man. And just kind of just let it flow. And you can see that come out a lot in his interactions. And he's very, very quick, like improvisational in his speech, improvisational and poetic. So he would be able to basically put on a role that he would play, and they would play act with each other. Like, especially him and Paul, they'd go back and forth with each other, like in character. Whoever those characters happen to be, those would be the ones that they're playing. And so it's that kind of just openness that I think factors into a lot of his later political activity, and his political thoughts, because, like I said, he doesn't come across at all as like a schooled leftist or a schooled political person. He was just open, intuitive, and therefore, like an individualist. He did things his way, and that's kind of he and Paul both, and that kind of caused some of the tensions, and George. So that caused some of the interpersonal tensions. But so John was one of those people that wouldn't get caught up in a group dynamic. He's got all these leftist radicals, and they say something he doesn't agree with. Well, he'll disagree with them. He's not going to just go along with the crowd. So he had his own, he had his own limits, and he had his own kind of developed, like, personal philosophy that, probably couldn't be put into words, or he wouldn't have written a manifesto on all his political thoughts. I think the impression I get again is that basically all that kind of came intuitively to him, because he was an intuitive person, like an extremely intuitive person. And so the last kind of major factor that I see that kind of came into this is just going back to the Beatles' career in the 60s, is that and this is probably one of the most important things, is that they were hugely popular. So they got hugely popular as being a pop band. So everyone knew who they were, and therefore John Lennon specifically had a captive audience. And that's pretty much the most important thing. If he was just some indie band, guy, and he wouldn't have had that much of an impact, and wouldn't have been seen as that much of a threat. It's because he had such popularity that he became so dangerous. So so there's that. Just a couple more things on the documentary itself, and on that conversation that Ilan brought up.
Well, I would just add that, he quite often, said, "Hey, we're all about peace and love." And this wasn't for him a cliche. It wasn't for him some kind of airy-fairy, lightly said, trendy statement. He meant it. He applied what peace and love meant for himself interpersonally with his family, with the band. But he also quite obviously thought about what it meant in the macro sense. What is peace and love really? How are we going to get there? Writ large, how are we all going to get there together?
Well, I think in that sense, even if he didn't intend it as cliche, I think because he was an intuitive artist, he does come off as kind of naive. Like he didn't have it all figured out. He had his ideals, he had his values, but even the fact that he was hanging out with radical leftists in the first place, like he was kind of naive and didn't really have a plan, or the kind of awareness to be able to realize that he shouldn't be hanging out with a lot of those people in the first place. Mm-hmm. And that's why he's not. Well, that's one of the reasons I think why he's not like a personal hero of mine. I like him. I appreciate a lot of what he did and his music, but I'm not sure how to quite formulate it, but.
Well, I think I know what you're saying, Harrison.
He was a lefty artist, idealistic artist.
Mm-hmm.
Imagine there's no religion. It's like, okay, we'll think that through a little bit. Like he had these kind of grand ideas, but
sure,
he wasn't a genius, like an intellectual genius.
No, but I would just say that the man's life was cut short at 40, mm-hmm. and if what he was able to begin to do post Beatles was any indication, who knows? Yeah. I'm not saying he would have been, the next Martin Luther King exactly, but it is interesting that in those sessions he does talk about listening to Martin Luther King's speech. He does talk about
Paul both
the inspiration and the poetry of King's speech, and the ability, the high ability to communicate certain ideas very, very powerfully. And when Lennon was assassinated, there was an outpouring of grief and community by millions around the world that was compared at the time to the outpourings at the assassinations of Martin Luther King, RFK, and JFK. And so, even if he was not able to, at the end of the day, accomplish with any kind of logical plan or an organization, those things that the others were working on, I think he was probably well on his way to a level of self-actualization in a much bigger context than he was able to ultimately do. So for me, it's like he's not Dag Hammarskjöld, he's not JFK or RFK, but there was
for an artist.
But there were all the raw material and intention and intuition, as you were saying earlier, all the drive, all the creativity was just latent and forming itself into even greater levels of self-empowerment and empowerment of others to think in different ways about things and to bring awareness to things in ways that had never been done before, or never would have been done in quite the same way that he would have.
Did you have something to say, Adam? So you got your thinking face on.
I got my thinking face on. Well, I was just trying to see if I could, in my mind, figure out where he would have ended up and where he would have gone as a person. It's like you said, Harrison, he was naive. He was idealistic. And you need that. Mm-hmm. Culturally, for one. Individually, it works better to be a practical practicalist. I don't know what that word would be.
Pragmatic.
To be pragmatic, yeah. But you need a culture needs idealists in order to send out the call for the more practical people to come up with actual, like, real world, tangible, like boots on the ground things that can be done to bring us from where we are to where we want to be, where we could be. And so that's part of the thing about, creativity and art. And that's one of the things that art's supposed to do. It's supposed to call to you. It's a call for something higher, from something higher to reach a higher level. And that was, who he kind of embodied, or what he embodied was that vessel for the call, and in some sense actualized some of those things. He wasn't perfect. Like, I was reading about his first wife, and how his first wife said that at one point John Lennon became very jealous and he was jealous and possessive. And so at one point she had gone out and was dancing with somebody at some place, and in the heat of the moment, he hit her.
I used to be mean to my woman. I beat her and kept her apart from the things that she loved.
And that was exactly what he said about why he wrote that. That was what he was referring to.
I didn't mean to hurt you. I didn't mean to make you cry. I'm just a jealous guy.
So that's insightful in and of itself, and the fact that he confessed up to it. And then she goes on to say that he never hit her again. He still had issues with being curt and using cutting remarks. That's kind of the double-edged sword of having that quick wit ability to strike at things like a viper.
Mm-hmm.
When the time calls for it, it's great. But when it's not the right time for it, it can cause some emotional and relational problems. And so that seems to have been, some of how that manifested for him personally and interpersonally.
There are anecdotes of other musicians who were close to John Lennon and other bands, because many of them knew each other, communicated, hung out with one another, who said that they had, they would go to John to talk about particular issues and things that they were going through. And in their experience, he was very helpful, very insightful guy who was able to give good advice. So it seems to me that, like everyone, he was on his own kind of path to growth, and had realized to some great degree that he could be doing an incredible amount of good for people by being, by having humility, by being of service to his friends, by championing causes. I mean, how many stories of pop stars do we hear where, they live to gratify their own hedonistic lives for the most part? And so that's another big observation that was made about John Lennon, is that he could have, he could have just lived for his own self-indulgent existence, but he chose, after he had gotten over a bad bout of drug addiction, to kind of reinvigorate his political life, and his what he must have felt as a kind of responsibility to give voice to things that others weren't.
If John Lennon was alive today, he'd be Kanye West.
He'd be visiting Putin.
No, Kanye is kind of like, of course, they're different in so many ways, but he's kind of like a modern John Lennon in the sense of the popular, just that huge kind of pop idol status. Everyone knows who he is, and he's to his own detriment, such an individualist and such a his own person. That he doesn't care what anyone else thinks. He'll just say whatever he wants. There's that similarity to them. Like, Kanye also is that kind of creative type. So I see echoes, yes, between Kanye and John Lennon.
Is Kanye just John Lennon reincarnated? That's too silly.
Because John Lennon faked his own death.
Yeah, he got a racial reassignment surgery. Could be.
And now Kanye is hanging out with the clone of Paul McCartney.
Yeah. Not the clone, he's the replacement.
The replacement, I see. Get your conspiracy theories straight here.
So that's an interesting kind of anecdote about him as a person, because it makes sense that he would be able to do the same kind of open, creative, intuitive, and empathetic interaction with his friends, with his peers, that he would have with the society at large, because that seemed to be kind of like his thing was an intuitive empathy, and a creative processing of a situation. And so his, all that combined with a quick wit, he can give you some really good advice on the spot.
I thought I might have mentioned this on a previous show, but Gary Zukov had a good, a helpful distinction. It was helpful to me in the exercise of power. There being two types. One is kind of like the power that we all are most familiar with in thinking of power, and that is, the politician, the businessman who exerts power for good or ill over others. Sometimes because it's the right thing to do, and sometimes because they just can. And then there was another definition, which was authentic power, which is which speaks to that individualism that you were mentioning earlier, Harrison, where the conscience of an individual, the drive, the level of soul strength, if you will, of a person exerts this authentic power, this power of benevolence and knowledge and kind of intuitive, positive, constructive influence over one's self, persons in one's sphere, and by extension, and sometimes, with a really super authentically powerful person, this more macro influence that people like King had, that people like Malcolm X in his later years had, and Lennon.
Well, do we want to try and figure out what kind of brain John Lennon had?
Well, I'll read something from The Matter with Things, just as kind of a loosely related, just on creativity, because McGilchrist has a good, he's got a whole chapter on creativity. And I want to read something about Mozart, seeing as how we're talking about musicians. Because McGilchrist's kind of like, he goes through the debate on what the nature of creativity is, and a lot of scientists are have been trying to figure out how that works in the brain and what the process is. He he's got an appendix in the book criticizing this one guy who wrote a book and some papers dismissing the idea that creativity has anything specific to do with the right hemisphere. And McGilchrist basically shows that he's wrong, that the right hemisphere is immensely important for creativity, which will become more understandable as we proceed with shows this year, because we'll be talking about this book a bunch. But I want to read, in this context, talking about the creative process, he quotes a letter from Mozart to a Baron B, who had inquired about how he set about writing and how it was that his work was so individual and distinctive. So Mozart wrote back, "How do I write, and how do I come to flesh out what are large general ideas? I really can't tell you any more than this, because I myself don't know any more about it, and can't get any further with it. It's when I'm feeling right, and things are good, perhaps riding in a coach or taking a walk after a good meal, or in the night when I can't sleep. These are the best times, when thoughts come flowing into my mind like a stream. How they come, and where they come from, I don't know, and I can't do anything about it. The ones I like, I keep in my head, and go around humming them. At least that's what people tell me. If I hang on to them, I soon come to see, one by one, how to use such and such a phrase, how to make a tasty dish out of them all, using counterpoint, and respecting the timbre of the different instruments, etc., etc., etc. That fires up my soul, and as long as I am not distracted, the work grows. I expand it, and it becomes clearer, until I have the thing pretty much finished in my head, even if it's long. So that from then on, I see it all in my mind's eye at a glance, much as one sees a beautiful picture or a pretty woman. And I don't hear it sequentially in my imagination, as it will have to be later on, but, as it were, all at once. When I later come to write it down, I just take straight out of my brain box what's already assembled there, as I've explained. For that reason, it goes down on paper pretty quickly, since, as I say, it's really already finished, and rarely turns out much different from what was in my head all along. That's why I don't mind being disturbed while writing, and I quite like all sorts of things going on all around me. I carry on writing just the same, and can even chat away at the same time about hens and geese, or Jack and Jill, or whatever. As to how it is that during the process my pieces come to take on a Mozartian form or style, one not like anybody else's, it's like asking why my nose is big and curved. It's Mozartian, and not like other people's. I don't aim for distinctiveness, and I can't really describe what's different about my style, but it's obvious that people who really have something particular about them will be different from each other on the inside as well as on the outside. All I know is that I am not the author of either kind of difference." So maybe I'll just read a little bit of McGilchrist's comment on that.
Well, you know what that reminds me of quite a bit? We were lucky enough to have author Mary Belloc on the show some months back, who described her process of writing her novels. And just to put it into perspective, if anybody's missed a show, you know, the romantic novel is widely considered to be one of the most widely read genre of novel in the US. And she's arguably one of the leading authors of that genre. Anyway, having enjoyed a lot of her novels, we asked her about the creative process, and you know, she gave an answer that's at least consistent with what you've read there, Harrison. It's kind of like she doesn't know where the ideas come from. She just allows herself to receive and I guess she doesn't question it too much. I'm paraphrasing. It's been several months since we've heard that description.
She made the distinction between plotters and pantsers. Mm-hmm. So the pantsers are the ones that fly by the seat of their pants, and the plotters are the ones that plot everything out. So the plotting everything out, that's a very left brain activity, following rules, having a structure. And then pantsing is very right brain. You just open up your mind and see the whole and see what happens, and it's very improvisational, like John Lennon's personality, as I mentioned.
Yeah.
And but yeah, that's a perfect example of that. I hadn't thought of that when reading, but yeah, it is a perfect example. He gives one more with Handel, who wrote The Messiah, I'll read this paragraph. Approaching 4 hours worth of some of the greatest and most inspired music ever written in just over 3 weeks, between 22nd August and 14th September 1741. Interestingly, while still recovering from his left hemisphere stroke. So I think, as we mentioned a couple of weeks ago, or a few weeks ago, left hemisphere, I don't know if I mentioned it actually, but left hemisphere strokes have the tendency of releasing the right hemisphere. So kind of like a creativity boost in this case. So of those 3 weeks of inspired creation, during which music seemed to pour out of him, he said, and I'll add, paraphrasing Paul in one of his letters, "Whether I was in my body or out of my body, I know not. God knows it." He also said, "I did think I did see all heaven before me and the great God himself." So particularly in the Mozart one, there's some interesting things in there. But one that relates back to the Beatles thing is that he mentions Mozart that he needs to be feeling right and things are good. So you could see that in the documentary, how things just weren't feeling right or good for that first week or so in the studio, and then once the environment kind of opened up, that really opened the band up. And but one of the other interesting things that we hadn't brought up yet is Paul McCartney. I mentioned him writing Get Back, but some of the most enjoyable parts for me were watching Paul. I think he's my favorite Beatle, but near the end, right before the concert, like a few days before the concert, a couple things on that. So they're worrying about the concert, whether they're going to do it, how they're going to do it, and they're kind of having this conversation about trying to plan it. And they realize they only have like 6 songs, and they're like, well, we can't have a 6-song concert. What are we actually going to do? Paul's trying to get them to come up with a plan. And John's just kind of sitting there being like, okay, yep. And okay, so what do we do with 6 songs? Maybe we just do a 6-song concert, which is what they ended up doing, but for other reasons. And then they're like, oh, well, who's got the list of our songs? So they're like producer guy, Mal, he brings out the list of songs and they're like, oh, we've got like 12 songs. It's like, we're good. So they didn't even realize that they had enough songs actually worked out. They'd been focusing so much on these 6 songs that they'd kind of forgotten the other ones. So that was kind of a relief for them. But then Paul says, might have been right before that the thing about the Beatles is that when they're pushed up against the wall, that's when they come through. So if they've got a deadline, he knows that when they get on stage, they're going to put on a great show. They're gonna pull through. And that's actually what happens. Mm-hmm. So watching it, you can see throughout these few weeks, you can see their doubts and wondering where this is going. I mean, the film crew, the film director is kind of like, well, we don't really have a story. It's like, what's going on? It's just a whole bunch of random stuff. And I was thinking the same thing. I'm like, well, is this going to turn out? It's like, how does this end? Because I wasn't really familiar with the story. I wasn't sure exactly how it was all going to play out. And then, so they have that conversation, and then in like a day or a day and a half, might have even been, I think they had 2 days at that point to work before the show. And then one other thing, they ended up doing this rooftop concert, right? So they don't know what the concert's going to be like for a long time, for all these weeks. And then at a particularly stressful point in the studio, two of their guys come up with the idea for this rooftop concert, and you can see it was captured on film when they were telling Paul about it. And Paul's like, and he's listening to them, and he goes,
in slow motion.
and his face like lights up. He's like, that's a great idea. And I was just that was one of the great moments. So they decided to do this rooftop concert, which was kind of just genius again in this postmodern sense, because they get up on the concert. And of course, no one can see them, mm-hmm. and they can't see anyone because they're at the top of this building in London, and they play a great show, and the cops show up and shut down the show, and so it's got drama, and the band is tight, and everything sounds good. They're having a great time up there, And so the documentary, it came together, and this whole month kind of really came together, even though the cops ended up shutting it down. But that even just heightened the entertainment value of it. And as the cops are their people are stalling the cops downstairs in the studio, and eventually they come up onto the roof, and you see Paul turning around, and he sees them, and he's just having the time of his life. He's having a great time. A little bit of what do you call it? Rule breaking.
Mm-hmm.
You know, he's having a great time breaking the rules, and that was just a joy to watch, because of course you see the people on the streets. There's people complaining. Of course, most people are enjoying it, but you have the couple of the old stodgy people being like, there's the lady saying, "Oh, I was having my nap and they woke me up and I don't like it one bit," and some people saying, "Oh, this is terrible for business. We can't do anything here," and so of course the cops have to shut them down. Cops are like 19 years old. Oh, we didn't mention that the Beatles themselves, they're all like 28, 29 in this. So just as a reference, so they're youngins, but that seems to be when a lot of artists are at their most creative, is in their 20s. But
just a couple of quick points about that also, and that is that the rooftop concert was right above their production studio, so they had only to go upstairs to not go to Tripoli at this Roman amphitheater, not go to this to this other estate or other building at the other side of town, but it was an easy solution. It was a creative solution, and it was so successful, and they sounded so good that a couple of the songs that they had played during that short concert were actually put on the LPs, that they were of such a high quality. So it was really true. I mean, they were, under all of this kind of uncertainty and pressure, they had gelled so much by the end of those 4 weeks or so that they were able to, in the cold, in the middle of January, on a roof, not in a studio, go to this great performance and get a couple of pieces of music that would be forever enshrined and embedded in the minds and hearts of music lovers. So it's quite a bit of history, and a kind of a little bit of a part of their legacy, that they were able to get back, come together, and do this performance and come out with I think 2 more albums before they finally broke up for good.
Well, yeah, one more in addition to Let It Be. So they did Let It Be, and then later that year they worked on Abbey Road, and then they broke up.
Yeah.
I want to say that the rooftop performance was worth the price of admission.
Yeah.
Which is, the previous like the 7 hours or whatever it was. Like that alone was worth the price of admission, between the tight performance of the band itself, to the reactions of all of the people on the streets, because they had a camera crew down there doing interviews of people, and they're like, "Oh, do you know who you're listening to?" "No, I don't know who it is, but I like it." And then a couple of being like, "That's the Beatles."
Obviously.
So that was really good. And then, the reactions to the cops coming, like Ringo playing the drums and then just looking over like, "Hey, what's going on? I'm Ringo." And then, the smirk of somebody who knows they're breaking the rules and is getting away with it, is from both Paul and John and George, is just, it's great.
Yeah, that was worth it.
Is there any other points that might be made about this? Any last thoughts?
No.
Well, we thank you folks for listening once again, and we look forward to catching up a little bit on the reading of The Matter of Things by Ian McGilchrist. By all accounts, it looks like a heck of a work to absorb and to glean valuable info about. And I think that's essentially it. We hope you guys have a great week, and thanks again for listening.